During the second night patrol, a royal guard noticed a narrow service passage door standing slightly open, though the nursery wing had been sealed an hour earlier. A wooden toy horse lay in the corridor, far beyond where any child was permitted. He stopped, listening. The surveillance camera above the nursery door had gone dark. Nothing moved, yet the silence felt staged. The service passage carried a different kind of silence than the main corridors of the palace. It was narrower, older, the stone walls absorbing sound rather than carrying it. The royal guard stood just inside the iron-framed doorway, one gloved hand resting lightly against the cold surface of the wall, feeling the faint vibration of distant ventilation ducts. The electric lamps overhead cast a steady, pale light that flattened every shadow, yet the passage still felt dim, as if the air itself resisted illumination. According to the rotation schedule, this section should have been secured and unused at this hour, and the camera mounted above the archway should have been transmitting continuously to the control room. He had already confirmed by radio that the feed showed no interruption, no gap, no anomaly. Yet he had seen the flicker himself, 2 seconds of darkness on the corridor monitor at the previous junction, long enough for a door to open, long enough for someone to pass. He moved forward, boots silent against the stone, and checked the secondary latch on the maintenance gate. It was closed, but not seated fully in its bracket, as if it had been shut quickly without the usual care. He examined the hinge, noticing a faint line where fresh metal showed through worn paint, recently handled, recently forced perhaps, or opened after long disuse. Procedure required him to secure the passage, report the irregularity, and wait for technical staff and a supervising officer before conducting any further inspection. He had already made the report. The reply from control was precise and calm. Remain in position, do not proceed beyond the threshold, technical verification in progress. He acknowledged the order, but the stillness in the passage pressed against him in a way that unsettled his instincts. Palaces were rarely silent. Even at night there were distant footsteps, murmured conversations, the faint movement of staff. Here there was nothing. Then, from farther down the passage, a sound reached him, so faint he first thought it was the settling of stone. A soft, irregular movement, not loud enough to echo, but distinct enough to be deliberate. He turned his head slightly, listening. The air carried the smell of polished wood and something else, something warmer, like fabric recently disturbed. He advanced 3 steps, slow and measured, until the passage bent toward the reinforced nursery access door. That door was closed, sealed, and secured by protocol at all hours unless authorized attendants were present. The guard studied it from several meters away. The indicator light above the frame showed locked status, steady green, yet the silence beyond it felt occupied, not empty. He keyed his radio once more, requesting confirmation of authorized personnel in the nursery wing. The reply came after a pause longer than usual. No movement scheduled, no staff logged in that sector. He felt the quiet weight of that answer settle in his chest. Another faint sound came from beyond the door, softer this time, controlled, as if someone were trying not to be heard. The guard shifted his stance, placing himself squarely between the passage and the door, and rested his hand near the latch of the emergency barrier, aware that whatever was on the other side had not yet realized the passage was no longer unobserved. He drew the portable barrier from its recessed housing, the metal rails sliding out with a low, restrained click that sounded louder than it was in the confined space. Working methodically, he secured it across the passage behind him, sealing the approach so that no one could enter or leave without passing directly in front of his position. It was a small deviation from standard procedure. Barriers were normally installed only after supervisory authorization, but it created a controlled perimeter, and control had already confirmed the absence of authorized personnel. The guard reported his action in calm, precise terms, careful to avoid speculation, and received a brief acknowledgment without further instruction. That in itself was unusual. Normally, a supervisor would have taken direct command by now. The air in the passage felt cooler as the ventilation system shifted cycles, carrying a low, steady hum that made the faint sounds beyond the nursery door harder to isolate. He focused on stillness, letting his breathing slow, allowing his hearing to separate the layers of sound, the distant machinery, the faint electrical buzz of the overhead lamps, and beneath it, once again, that restrained movement from the other side of the door. Not the erratic motion of a child playing, not the heavier sound of staff at work, but something deliberate and measured. He stepped closer, careful to keep his boots from striking the floor with force, and placed his gloved hand lightly against the surface of the reinforced wood. It was slightly warmer than the surrounding air, suggesting recent activity within. Protocol dictated that he should not open the door without proper authorization, especially in a protected royal area, yet the absence of any authorized entry and the unexplained camera irregularity formed a pattern he could not ignore. He keyed his radio again, requesting immediate confirmation that no administrative inspection or maintenance activity had been scheduled under special authority. The reply came back negative. A longer silence followed, as if the control room itself was reconsidering the situation. The guard withdrew his hand from the door and stepped back to his position between the barrier and the entrance, creating a clear line of sight to both. His role, above all, was to control access, to ensure that whatever was inside remained protected, and whatever was outside could not reach it without scrutiny. Minutes passed, slow and deliberate, measured only by the quiet rhythm of his breathing and the steady glow of the indicator light. Then, from beyond the door came a sound that was unmistakable, a faint, muffled thud, followed by a brief scraping, as though something light had been moved across the floor with care rather than force. The guard felt the subtle tightening of his focus, the sharpening of attention when uncertainty began to take shape. He reached for the radio once more, preparing to request immediate supervisory presence, when footsteps approached from the far end of the outer corridor beyond the passage entrance, measured, purposeful, and drawing steadily nearer. The footsteps approaching the passage were steady and unhurried, the measured cadence of trained staff rather than the heavier stride of armed guards. The royal guard remained where he was, positioned between the nursery door and the barrier, his posture calm but immovable. 2 palace attendants appeared at the far end of the passage, their dark uniforms neat, their expressions composed, yet both slowed slightly when they saw the barrier already in place. The air carried a faint scent of polished linen from the carts they pushed, but beneath it the guard detected something less ordinary, the subtle tension in their movements, the careful way they avoided looking directly at the nursery door. One of them produced a small leather-bound logbook and spoke in a low, respectful tone, stating that they were scheduled to conduct a routine inspection of the nursery wing fixtures. The guard listened without interrupting, his gaze shifting briefly to the logbook, then back to their faces. Routine inspections were never conducted without advance notice to the guard rotation, and none had been logged in the hourly briefing. He requested to see the authorization page. The attendant hesitated for only a fraction of a second before opening the book and turning it toward him. The entry was written in precise handwriting, bearing a seal impression that at first glance appeared valid, yet something about it felt subtly wrong, not the seal itself, but the ink surrounding it, slightly darker than the ink used in the entry above, as if applied at a different time. The guard closed the book gently and handed it back, his voice even, as he informed them that access was temporarily restricted due to an ongoing security verification. The attendants exchanged a brief glance, quickly masked, and one of them asked how long the delay would last. The guard answered that he did not know. Silence settled again, thicker now, filled with the low hum of ventilation and the faint, controlled movement that still came, intermittently, from beyond the nursery door. The attendants seemed to hear it as well, One shifted his grip on the cart handle, fingers tightening almost imperceptibly. The guard observed this without comment, noting the detail and storing it in the quiet, methodical way training had taught him. After a moment, he instructed them to remain where they were until further authorization arrived. They complied, but the stillness that followed felt strained, as if every second carried an unspoken calculation. Then, from inside the nursery, a faint sound emerged again, soft, rhythmic, and too deliberate to be dismissed as settling wood or shifting fabric. The guard saw the attendant's eyes flick briefly toward the door, and in that instant his unease deepened into certainty that something behind that door was not proceeding as it should. Minutes passed with deliberate slowness, the kind that stretched awareness and sharpened every small detail. The royal guard kept his position, aware of the attendants behind him, aware of the sealed passage, and most of all aware of the presence on the other side of the nursery door. He keyed his radio quietly and requested verification of the authorization seal recorded in the attendant's logbook, transmitting the identification number printed beside the entry. The reply did not come immediately. Instead, there was a pause, broken only by faint static, and then the voice of the duty officer returned, lower than before, stating that the seal number corresponded to a valid administrative office, but no inspection order had been filed for this date or time. The guard acknowledged the message without turning, feeling the weight of it settle into the space around him. Someone with access to administrative materials had created an entry that appeared legitimate but had never been recorded in the official schedule. He let the radio fall silent at his shoulder and studied the nursery door again. The indicator light remained steady, the lock engaged, yet the faint sounds within continued at irregular intervals, as if someone were moving cautiously, pausing often, listening. He stepped closer, placing himself just within arm's reach of the handle, and spoke through the door in a calm, clear voice, identifying himself and requesting confirmation of the occupants inside. No answer came, only the soft hum of the ventilation system, and, after a few seconds, a slight sound like fabric brushing against wood, abruptly stilled. Behind him, one of the attendants shifted his weight, and the wheels of the cart gave a faint creak. The guard turned his head slightly, just enough to see them in his peripheral vision. Both stood very still now, their earlier composure replaced by a careful neutrality that felt practiced rather than natural. He realized then that the situation had already moved beyond a simple irregularity. The altered logbook, the unauthorized seal, the unexplained presence behind a secured door, these were not isolated errors, but connected elements of a deliberate act. Procedure dictated that he wait for supervisory authority before taking further action, yet every passing minute allowed whatever was unfolding inside the nursery to continue without intervention. The temperature in the passage felt cooler now, the stone walls releasing the chill of the night, and the guard became aware of the steady rhythm of his own breathing inside the collar of his uniform. He reached for the radio again, preparing to escalate the report to the senior security officer, when a new set of footsteps echoed faintly from the outer corridor, heavier than those of the attendants, confident, approaching without hesitation, and accompanied by the quiet metallic sound of a ceremonial chain striking against fabric. The attendants straightened immediately, their posture shifting to formal attention even before the figure came into view, and the guard understood that someone with higher authority was about to enter the passage. The footsteps grew louder, measured and assured, carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The royal guard remained facing the nursery door, but his attention sharpened as the figure entered the passage behind the attendants. A senior palace official approached, dressed in the dark formal attire of administrative command, the narrow ceremonial chain at his collar catching the pale light of the overhead lamps. His expression was composed, almost patient, yet his eyes moved quickly, taking in the barrier, the attendants, and finally the guard standing between the passage and the nursery door. The official greeted him in a calm voice and stated that the situation was under administrative review and that the passage was to be cleared immediately. The wording was precise, carefully neutral, but it carried the unmistakable tone of an order rather than a request. The guard turned fully now, meeting the official's gaze. He requested to see the written authorization transferring control of the scene from security to administration. The official produced a document folder and opened it, revealing a stamped directive bearing the palace crest. At first glance it appeared legitimate, but the guard noticed that the time of issue printed at the top was only minutes earlier, issued after the attendants had already arrived with their altered logbook. That sequence did not align with normal procedure. Administrative orders followed reports, not the reverse. He studied the seal more closely, observing the slight impression of the wax and the faint irregularity at one edge, as if pressed in haste. The official's voice remained calm, but firmer now, reminding the guard that failure to comply with a lawful directive constituted a breach of duty. The attendants stood motionless, eyes lowered, the carts silent behind them. The passage felt narrower than before, the air heavier, carrying the faint scent of dust and cold stone. From beyond the nursery door came another soft sound, brief but unmistakable, followed by silence. The guard felt the familiar internal tension of conflicting obligations, obedience to rank on one side, protection of the vulnerable on the other. Training emphasized the chain of command, yet it also emphasized the primary duty of the royal guard, the safety of those under their protection, above all else. He asked the official one more question, his tone respectful but steady, requesting confirmation of who was currently inside the nursery and under whose authority the inspection was being conducted. The official answered that such details were administrative and did not require disclosure at this stage. That response, more than anything, confirmed the guard's concern. The royal guard stepped slightly to the side, positioning himself so that his body remained directly between the nursery door and the open passage, an unmistakable physical barrier. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and precise, carrying no hint of defiance, only the clarity of a professional statement. He informed the official that until the identities of those inside the secured area were verified and the authorization sequence confirmed through security command, he could not relinquish control of the passage. The words were carefully chosen, framed not as refusal, but as adherence to standing protection protocol. The official's expression hardened, though only slightly, the change visible more in the tightening of his jaw than in any overt display of anger. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, reminding the guard that administrative authority extended over all internal operations and that delays could have serious consequences for palace governance. The guard listened without interruption, aware of the attendants behind the official, aware of the faint intermittent sounds still coming from the nursery, and aware of the weight of every second passing without resolution. He keyed his radio and calmly reported the presence of an administrative order that conflicted with standing security directives, requesting immediate confirmation from senior security command. The official's eyes flicked briefly toward the radio, and for the first time a trace of impatience showed. The reply from command did not come immediately. The silence that followed seemed to stretch, filled only by the low hum of ventilation and the distant echo of footsteps far beyond the passage. The guard remained motionless, every sense alert, his position unchanged. Finally, the radio crackled to life, and the voice of a senior security officer instructed all parties to hold their positions until verification could be completed. The order applied to everyone, including the official. The passage fell into a tense stillness. The official said nothing, but the set of his shoulders revealed restrained frustration. The attendants avoided looking at anyone, their composure now visibly strained. Then, from beyond the nursery door, came a faint sound that cut through the silence with quiet clarity, a soft, uneven movement, followed by what sounded like a small object falling lightly against the floor. The guard turned his head slightly toward the door, every instinct sharpening, aware that whatever was happening inside was continuing while authority and procedure struggled in the corridor. The sound from inside the nursery was followed by silence so complete that it seemed to absorb even the hum of the ventilation. The royal guard remained facing the door, his attention fixed, while the tension behind him thickened in the narrow passage. Seconds later, the radio at his shoulder crackled again. The senior security officer's voice came through, steady but decisive, authorizing a controlled entry into the nursery under joint supervision of security personnel and administrative witnesses. Reinforcements were already on their way. The official exhaled slowly, as if conceding ground without admitting it, and stepped back to allow the process to proceed. Within minutes, 2 additional guards arrived, their presence bringing with it the faint scent of cold air from the outer corridors and the muted sound of boots on stone. Procedures unfolded with quiet efficiency. The lock was disengaged under observation, seals inspected, and the door opened inward a measured distance before anyone crossed the threshold. The nursery was dimly lit, illuminated only by a small lamp near the far wall. The air inside was warmer than the passage, carrying the faint smell of wood polish and linen. Toys were arranged on low shelves, small chairs pushed neatly beneath the table, everything appearing undisturbed at first glance. Yet the stillness of the room felt unnatural, as if it had been carefully composed rather than naturally left at rest. The guard entered first, his movements slow and deliberate, scanning every corner, every shadow. Near the center of the room, a small wooden block lay on its side, the only object out of place. He crouched briefly, noting the faint scuff mark beside it, as though something light had been moved across the floor not long before. Behind him, the other guards spread out methodically, checking windows, cupboards, and the adjoining washroom. No one spoke unless necessary, their communication limited to brief, precise confirmations. The child's bed stood untouched, the covers smooth, the pillows undisturbed. There was no immediate sign of anyone present, yet the guard felt with increasing certainty that the room had not been empty long. He moved toward the storage wall at the far end, where a row of cabinets stood flush with the paneling. One cabinet door hung slightly ajar, only a fraction of an inch, barely noticeable unless one was looking directly at it. He paused, studying the gap, aware of the faint draft of cooler air touching his face. The cabinet opened with a soft, controlled movement, revealing not shelves, but a narrow recess behind the paneling. The air that drifted from it carried the scent of dust and old stone, colder than the nursery and faintly metallic. The guard directed his flashlight into the opening, the beam cutting through darkness to reveal a concealed maintenance access, an old service corridor, no wider than a single person, descending slightly into shadow. The edges of the panel showed fresh abrasions where the mechanism had been forced or recently manipulated, and the hinges still carried a faint sheen of disturbed dust. One of the reinforcing guards stepped closer, quietly confirming that this access did not appear on the modern architectural plans for the wing. It was part of an older structure, long sealed and forgotten in routine security sweeps. The royal guard studied the floor at the threshold and saw the faint imprint of a shoe sole in the dust, partially smudged but recent, leading inward and then back again. Whoever had opened the passage had not intended to remain.
Behind him, the senior official entered the nursery, his expression carefully neutral as he observed the hidden opening. For a moment, no one spoke. The significance of the discovery settled over the room with quiet weight. This was not an accidental breach, not a child wandering into a restricted area, but a deliberate use of a concealed route designed to bypass both cameras and guard rotations. The guard stepped back from the opening, allowing the investigation team to document the scene, yet his attention drifted to a small chair near the wall where a folded blanket lay. It was slightly displaced, as if someone small had sat there not long before being guided away. The implication formed silently in his mind, tightening his chest with a restrained professional concern. The child was not here now, but at some point he had been. The radio at his shoulder sounded again, requesting immediate confirmation of the nursery's status. The guard answered in measured terms. Concealed access discovered. Signs of recent use. No immediate occupant. As he lowered the radio, he became aware of a new sound drifting faintly from the dark opening behind the cabinet, a distant metallic echo, subtle but unmistakable, as if a door far along the hidden passage had just been closed.
The faint metallic echo faded into the distance, leaving the hidden passage silent once more. The royal guard stood near the cabinet opening, listening for any further movement, but only the low circulation of air remained. Reinforcement teams were already being redirected to seal the outer exits connected to the older service corridors, yet the guard understood from the timing alone that whoever had used the passage was unlikely to be intercepted quickly. The network of maintenance routes beneath the palace was extensive, mapped in fragments across different archives, some sections sealed decades earlier and rarely inspected. He stepped aside as technical staff began documenting the opening, photographing the hinges, the dust impressions, and the scuffed panel edges. The senior security officer arrived shortly afterward, his presence bringing a quiet shift in authority that settled the room into purposeful order. The royal guard gave a concise verbal account, describing the camera irregularity, the altered logbook, the administrative directive, and the sounds heard from within the nursery. He avoided speculation, reporting only what he had personally observed. The officer listened without interruption, then instructed that the nursery wing remain sealed until a full sweep of the hidden corridor could be completed. The child, now safely under medical supervision in another part of the palace, was reported to be unharmed but shaken, a detail conveyed in a brief, controlled tone that carried more weight than any elaborate description could have. As the investigation expanded, attention turned to the surveillance and access records. The royal guard accompanied the officer to the control room, where the atmosphere was markedly different from its usual quiet efficiency. Technicians moved between consoles with subdued urgency, scrolling through logs, cross-checking timestamps, and comparing archived backups. On one of the monitors, the guard saw the corridor camera feed from earlier in the evening. The sequence where he had witnessed the flicker appeared continuous now, showing no interruption at all. The timestamp advanced smoothly, frame by frame, as if the darkness he had seen had never occurred. A technician explained in a low voice that segments of the recording had been overwritten, not crudely deleted, but replaced with duplicated footage from a previous hour, matched carefully enough to evade casual detection. The precision of it suggested not only technical knowledge, but authorized access to the recording system itself. The guard felt a quiet tightening in his thoughts. This was no longer merely an intrusion. It was manipulation from within the structure of authority that governed the palace's daily operations. A list of administrative access credentials appeared on another screen, and several entries were flagged. Logins recorded at times when their assigned users had officially been elsewhere. Someone had used legitimate credentials to alter both surveillance records and movement logs, creating a false continuity that concealed the breach. The senior security officer gave instructions to isolate those accounts and restrict further access, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of resolve. As the guard observed the unfolding process, he became aware of the deeper implication. If the passage had not been blocked, if the attendants had been allowed through, the concealed route would have provided an unobstructed path directly to the nursery, bypassing every visible layer of security. The realization settled heavily, not as fear, but as the sober recognition of how narrowly the outcome had differed from what might have occurred. The investigation continued through the night, moving from the control room to administrative offices where access to archival systems was maintained. The Royal Guard remained present to provide clarifications whenever requested, though his role gradually shifted from active responder to silent witness as analysts reconstructed the chain of events. A pattern emerged with quiet clarity. An individual within the administrative branch had begun altering minor scheduling entries weeks earlier, small changes unlikely to attract attention, an inspection rescheduled, a maintenance request logged and then quietly removed, minor discrepancies that blended into the routine flow of palace operations. Those gradual adjustments had prepared the conditions for the false inspection order and the altered logbook entry that brought the attendants to the nursery passage. The concealed corridor, once rediscovered in an old architectural survey, had been opened in stages, its external access point masked as routine structural maintenance. Each step had been deliberate, patient, and carefully documented in falsified records. The purpose, investigators concluded, was not immediate harm, but leverage, an attempt to demonstrate the ability to reach the most protected areas of the palace undetected, a threat intended to exert pressure rather than to be carried out. Even so, the presence of the child within reach of such a plan lent the findings a gravity that no formal language could soften. Near dawn, a preliminary report was prepared for the highest levels of palace authority. The language was restrained, describing the incident as a procedural anomaly involving unauthorized record modification, yet those who had stood in the passage understood how much had been contained within that measured phrase. The Royal Guard stepped out briefly into a side corridor where the early light of morning filtered through high windows, turning the stone floor pale and cold. The palace was beginning to stir, distant footsteps and the faint clatter of service carts echoing in the distance, ordinary sounds returning as if the night's events had been only a passing disturbance. He rested one gloved hand lightly against the window ledge, feeling the chill of the stone, and allowed himself a single quiet breath of release. Not relief exactly, but the steadying awareness that the child was safe and the breach contained. Later that morning, as the formal statements were finalized, the senior security officer approached him with a brief nod of acknowledgement. No praise was offered, no extended conversation, only the simple confirmation that his decision to hold the passage prevented an unauthorized entry and allowed the breach to be exposed before it could progress further. The guard inclined his head in return, the exchange understood without further words. By midday, the sealed sections of the palace were gradually reopened, routines resuming with careful precision. Yet among the guards, the memory of the night remained vivid. The faint sound behind a locked door, the altered seal, the quiet decision to remain in place when procedure alone might have dictated otherwise.
In official records, it would remain a procedural anomaly, a brief disruption in an otherwise orderly system. But for those who had stood in that narrow passage, it would always be remembered as the night when instinct, tempered by discipline, had quietly preserved what procedure alone could not.